In a quiet corner of Wales, which you may or may not know, there's a name that pops up fairly regularly. This man's name is only said out loud within the context of the street or the community centre named after him, in almost a whisper. But this Garrow boy changed the world, and is certainly someone that needs to be shouted about. So, who is Richard Price? If you're unsure who he is, don't worry, you're not alone. I grew up in the Garrow Valley, as did many generations of my family, but not one of us could give you an informed line on the man or his impact on the world. But trust me, this guy is a big deal. 2023 marked the 300th birthday of Dr. Richard Price, and we celebrated with a year-long programme of events to reintroduce this amazing man to the world. One of the highlights was a theatre production by Contemporancient theatre called Price of Change.
We're standing on a hill just above the village of Llangeinor, which is to the north of Bridgend in the Garrow Valley. And as you enter the village, it calls it the historic village of Llangeinor. And I guess what we see now, a couple of hundred years ago, would have been almost none of it would have been visible from this viewpoint. You might have seen one or two farms, and maybe one or two houses clustered together as a small hamlet in the bottom of the valley. Changed by mining, of course, at the beginning of the 20th century. This whole valley would have been filled with 8 or 9 mines, 6 or 7 of which would have been deep mines, and the whole place would have changed. And now it seems quite rural again. And on this slightly drizzly morning, it's particularly lovely and peaceful, looking down over what feels like quite a rural idyll. In my play, The Price of Change, I tell the story of a man who lived in a farmhouse over there. You can see it brighter than the others, this white Tintern house. And Richard Price was born there in 1723 and lived in this valley in his formative years. Spent a lot of time climbing these hills, very keen on climbing that hill over there in particular. And who would have known that he was to turn out to be Wales's greatest ever thinker, a moral philosopher of huge importance on the world stage. And when I first came across him, after seeing a painting of him by Kevin Sinnott, I felt I had to tell his story. And in telling his story, I wanted to think about what was important about it today. I wasn't just interested in the history of Richard Price, but in the kind of legacy of Richard Price. What's the importance and significance of it today? So in the play, we tell the story of Carrie, a young girl who was brought up in Llangeinor, and after her mum dies when she's in university, she comes back with her dad to live in Richard Price's house. And she comes there when Wales is just about to vote on independence. And we think in the play about Price's thoughts about the independence for America and our thoughts about an independent Wales. And those things come together in a really kind of exciting and challenging way. That's the story we're telling in Price of Change.
His father, Rhys Price, was a nonconformist, a religion with quite strict rules. And when Richard started to have his own ideas about things, his dad tried everything to keep him on track. These were crucial years for Richard Price, where he spent a lot of time talking and thinking about big questions like God, faith, and what different religions believe from a Welsh nonconformist point of view. He was laying the foundations and learning all the things that would make him the man he'd grow up to be.
There are lots and lots of fantastic stories about Richard Price, and some of them about him growing up here. And one particular one that struck me when I first came across it was a story of his father coming home and finding him home for the weekend from school. He's sitting by the fire reading a book, which turns out to be a volume by a theologian or preacher called Samuel Clarke. And his father goes completely berserk, grabs the book off him, throws it in the fire, and actually moves Price from the school he was in because this book had been recommended to him by one of his school teachers. And Samuel Clarke was just what we would think of now as a fairly liberal theologian. Price's father was very austere, believed in what was called Calvinism, which was that everything was preordained by God, everything was fixed, nothing could be changed. If you were working class, you would live that. If you were poor, you would live that. If you were rich, you would live that. And Price, even at 12 or 13, was getting excited by kind of liberal ideas, ideas about freedom of choice, ideas about believing different things about God and about the world from those that his father believed. And from that point on, he and his father didn't see eye to eye, and within 4 or 5 years his dad was dead. But it tells us about, at 12 or 13, Price was already a very acute mind and becoming very interested in ideas about freedom.
He grew up in Wales, and this place was shaping his values, evolving his perspective into a more Unitarian approach. This way of thinking used logic and allowed everyone the right to choose their own beliefs, rather than being based on very strict rules. It was all about loving your neighbour and working for a better world together. Richard Price's strong beliefs about faith and freedom helped shape the big ideas and achievements he became known for. He was a moral philosopher, a mathematician, and a political reformer. This guy was an absolute game changer. In 1740, 17-year-old Richard Price decided to shake things up and move to London. He actually walked there. With his parents passing, he saw a chance to start fresh and carve out his own path. Newington Green, North London. Price eventually settled here in 1758 and eventually became minister of the Unitarian Chapel. When Richard reached London at the age of 17, he went on to study at Moorfield Academy, and his uncle took him in, where Richard was able to nurture his thinking and develop his craft, and become part of the discussions on the hot topics of the day. After the death of his uncle in 1757, Price was well established and financially independent, and married his lifelong partner, Sarah Blundell. He was now part of the it crowd, mingling with radical thinkers and reformers. Richard Price became a figure he would have admired himself as a young man. He became one of the key thinkers helping to shape new ideas and spark change in the 18th century. That same year, Price published a book called Review of the Principal Questions and Difficulties in Morals. This book set out his ideas about right and wrong and helped shape how he saw the world. The book made a huge impact and showed he was one of the leading philosophers and thinkers of his time. Richard Price's journey from a bold teenager to a leading intellectual is nothing short of inspiring. He showed what, with courage, hard work, and determination, you can make a name for yourself and leave a lasting impact on the world. Richard Price was a polymath, the ultimate multitasker of the 1700s. Price's ideas were bold and ahead of their time, shaped by his life growing up in Wales. He mixed his thoughts about philosophy, right and wrong, politics and religion into one big picture, which gave him a really fresh way of seeing the world. People took notice of Price because he was well respected in lots of areas. He believed in self-rule and freedom, which matched the values of his Unitarian faith. Back then, his ideas seemed radical, but today they'd be seen as supporting democracy. Price's passion for people having freedom to make their own choices fit right in with his support for the big revolutions in France and America, where people were fighting to ditch monarchies, which we'll get into in a bit. It's quite hard to believe that the AI being developed today is based on the work of this guy from Llangeinor in the 1700s. But it's true. In simple terms, artificial intelligence looks at what's happening and figures out how things might turn out differently if the situation changed. In 1763, Price edited Thomas Bayes' work on probability, laying the groundwork for modern insurance and even influencing things like the possibilities of the Titanic and the space shuttle. Price's political and societal belief in a large and monumental change was also tied to his mathematical interests. Even before the American Revolution kicked off, Price was already speaking out, saying places like France and the American colonies should ditch their kings and run things themselves. This was quite risky business, as it made him a traitor in the eyes of some. If there's one thing that people know about Richard Price, it's that he had links to America and was friends with this guy.
Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers of America, one of the people who wrote the American Constitution, one of the people whose vision for a new society, a new world in a new place helped to bring it about.
Back in the day, American colonists were super unhappy with King George III. They felt like they were being treated unfairly and saw the king as a total tyrant. Richard Price's ideas about free will and morality were a big deal for these political beliefs. In 1776, Right after the American Revolution kicked off, Price published a book with a super long title. This book made Richard Price a total hero in America and established him as a key political figure. If this book was released today, it would have totally gone viral. It sold out in 3 days, was reprinted 7 times in a year, and even got translated into Dutch, French, and German. Price's ideas had a massive impact and helped shape the early thinking behind how the United States was built. Now let's talk about Benjamin Franklin. He was a founding father, a scientist, a statesman, a publisher, and basically a genius. No wonder he and Richard Price got on so well. They became friends through their work on national debt and shared political views. They became great friends and wrote letters to each other for decades. The founding fathers were so impressed with Price that they offered him a US citizenship and wanted him to be their financial advisor, but Price politely declined both offers. Richard Price was a millennialist, which means he believed that society and its rulers were corrupt and needed drastic change. For him, this change was the French Revolution. He loved the idea of democracy and thought the revolution was something he could passionately get behind because it aimed to get rid of the monarchy, just like America did. Back in Britain, Price met with Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger and was asked to come up with a plan to reduce the national debt. Everyone wanted a piece of this Garrow boy.
Mary Wollstonecraft, what an incredible woman, so ahead of her time, and now at last recognised as the first great feminist.
She moves to Newington Green to open a school and becomes inspired by Price.
She came to hear me preach, but not just to listen. Oh, she had questions, ideas.
And her ideas were based around the equal rights for men and women. Price was totally on board with this, even though these ideas were way different from what most people thought.
Men must be able to read to vote with understanding.
Do you imagine then that the men who vote now understand the issues? Do not they vote for their own interests alone in most cases?
Of course, you are right.
And if it is education and being informed which is at issue, might not I vote? Might not your wife vote, Dr. Price? Are we not educated and informed? Are not most of our schools run by young women? Oh, I know, Mr. Franklin, that a vote for my sex is a long way off in Britain. But you have begun with the cleanest of clean sheets. Well, you wrote a constitution for a brand new nation in a brand new place. Almost an Eden, and you have missed a chance. Oh, a chance you have let slip for your mothers and your sisters and your daughters and your wives to have shared a full part in the new world with you. Now they will remain the vassals that we are here in the old world. Oh, sir, you have done great things, but you have let your women down.
I am so glad you are to settle here and to teach here. I hope you will always be our friend.
Price had his fan club, but he almost certainly had his haters, who thought his ideas were a bit too wild.
Edmund Burke was a political philosopher who became something of an enemy of Richard Price, fearful of the freedoms that Price wanted to see for ordinary people. Burke went on to be the founding father of the modern Conservative Party. No surprise there.
When Edmund Burke started throwing shade at Price, she wrote letters and pamphlets to set the record straight. Price had a mixed crowd. In the American colonies, people loved him and his ideas. They thought he was a hero. The French revolutionaries described him as the implacable enemy of tyrants, a benefactor of humanity, and the apostle of liberty. Whilst many in Britain were a bit less enthusiastic, and saw Price as a dangerous man who could be looking to cook up a revolution here too. When we think about someone who lived so long ago, it's sometimes so hard to relate to them, or see them as real people. But they are people of their time, like we are of ours. Think about how you and I will be thought of in a few hundred years' time. Richard Price was just a super nice guy who wanted to make the world better. He was a thinker, a talker, and a doer. Price was really religious, but he could still think outside the box when it came to politics and maths. He believed in virtue, knowledge, and truth, which are the basics of a democratic society. Price was super proud of being Welsh. He visited Wales every year and never forgot where he came from. He believed that individuals could and should shape society, and that we should always expect the best from our politicians, something we should still expect today.
It's interesting that obviously most people's view of Price comes from one particular portrait, and a very, very sombre portrait of a man clad in black with a very, very old-fashioned wig, when there was old-fashioned even at the time. And that's our kind of notion of Price. But when we read about Price, we find that that is a very, very a far from accurate picture of the man. That in fact, you know, yes, he was a quiet and he was a shy man. He didn't want lots of portraits taken of him. He was very uncomfortable about having that portrait done, simply because he was not somebody who sought the limelight for himself at all. But he was somebody who absolutely was a lover of fun. You know, he was somebody who got up to all kinds of exploits at home and with his friends, loved any kind of physical challenge, loved being out swimming in the sea, he had a massive love of arm wrestling, which he thought was terrific. He had organised a hopping race around his own house for the local people on a Sunday morning after church. He's very into the kind of idea of a physical challenge. Also, I think what you get from his relationship with his wife was that it was quite a unique one, that they were very, very close to one another, shared ideas and shared thoughts, you know. She wasn't somebody who just kind of cooked his meals and looked after him. She was somebody who kind of shared every aspect of his thoughts and, you know, helped develop ideas with him. So I think he was a man who enjoyed being at home with his wife, enjoyed having fun with his friends, enjoyed discussions and the equivalent of the pub, but wasn't somebody who wanted to make big public speeches at all or have his portrait painted.
In 1786, Price's wife Sarah passed away. A couple of years later, in 1789, Richard Price gave his final sermon, calling for a world full of liberty and happiness. He retired a few years later in 1791 and passed away in April of that year at the age of 68. He's buried here, Bunhill Cemetery, which is a non-conformist ground in London. Some people think that Richard Price isn't remembered very well because his life and work were mostly in London and benefited America and France more than Wales. Even his plaque at Bunhill Fields Cemetery only mentions his contributions to life assurance, which is important, but doesn't really tell the whole story of who he was.
People might wonder why we would think of Price and why history would think of him, particularly as a Welshman, having spent most of his life in London. I mean, walked to London, only really come back a couple of times a year. But Price is very, very specifically Welsh. He was from a kind of dissenting background, one that didn't agree with the established church. And in almost every aspect of his life, he was an outsider. He didn't become part of Parliament because of his religious beliefs, despite the fact that he was effectively the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, and was always a dissenting and a different voice, the voice of an outsider, someone who challenged the orthodoxy. And in the end, of course, one of the reasons that he wasn't, or was almost removed deliberately from history, was because he was in such opposition to what the UK government believed. He was in favour of American independence and directly involved in it. He was in favour of the French Revolution and directly involved in supporting it. And I think the English government was enabled almost to write him out of history because of his support for the French Revolution. They could say, well, look, this is what comes of your rebellious attitudes. You know, we'll end up with the guillotine and fire in the streets. And you know, I guess modern France, with its freedom from a class system, could at least look back now and see Price as a hero too. But certainly he was a voice that England and those in power wanted quietened, wanted shut up, wanted removed from history.
He also had quite a famous cousin who lived just down the road in my stake, Anne Maddox, the maid of Kevin Udvar, a story coined as the Welsh Romeo and Juliet, which was immortalised by the song Llangeinor Gwenith Gwyn. I wonder if Price composed a poem or a catchy song, would he have been so lost to time? This is something that Contemporancient Theatre have worked to try and fix recently with a score to their play, Price of Change.
Of change I dream of and dread the day there's always a price to pay for breaking the old chain.
This boy from Tintern is an important character for Wales and the world. He belongs to us then and also today. His legacy is still relevant, and we have so much to thank him for. So the next time you see the name Richard Price in the community, you can be proud of our neighbour who contributed so much to Wales and the world.
Strange, I feel my heart take the strain. Change is coming.